So this is something different. If you've seen some talks that I've given here before, where my background is principally in foundations of probability and statistics. But I've been thinking, as maybe many people have been, about the forces that have been, that I think it's obvious that there are many, a confluence, I would say, of forces that are putting liberal democracies under strain. And on the one hand, at least I'm speaking for myself, it's obvious that this is happening, but also obscure and understanding exactly why and what to do about these things. So there's a couple of themes that I've been thinking about working on recently, and I wanted to try this out on you. So one is to start with just the brief, the potted argument for liberal democracies, and it's a welfare argument. The basic idea is that, well, liberal democracies are the key to shared prosperity. And you'll see data that looks something like this. So this is a chart of GDP this is from England. And if you were to project prior to 1200, you start getting into, the records start to become thin. Then you start getting into archaeological records, but for most of humanity, it's a flat line. And then thereabouts, basically the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and then upticking into the middle of the 19th century. You had, this is also sort of, you can understand Karl Marx looking around in the middle of the 19th century and has seen for the first time in history how much things have improved, and just was thinking, well, okay, it's just only a matter of time now before people, we have enough wealth for humanity and for well-being, so we should anticipate capitalism giving way to socialism. I should mention Marx. If you read Marx actually and Milton Friedman, they're identical pretty much. They just disagree on, Marx was saying waiting any time for this to end, and basically Milton Friedman says it's asymptotic, right? So they're just disagreeing over when the game will end. But anyway, you'll see data like this. You'll see a couple of little blips here. Basically, this first one, this is the First World War, this is the Second World War, and this is the latest economic crisis from 10 years ago, and that's ending in 2016. We'll see what Brexit brings. So that's England, and then you can tell this story for other countries, where here, basically, this is the argument that has been given since the last World War. And it says, look, if you plot the welfare of countries, there's different ways to measure this, and it'll all generate plots of this kind, where rich and poor is on the y-axis, and let's say democratic, by which I mean liberal democracy, liberal democratic governance versus undemocratic governance. And you'll see a rough correlation between the more democratic you make your country, your economy, the more wealth you will see. And the exceptions over here in the upper left quadrant, these tend to be countries that are, well, like Saudi Arabia or oil or mining countries that have their wealth from extracting elements from the environment. Down over here, you have places like North Korea. Now, so if you were to take a look, let's say, at individual countries, so this is Russia's trajectory on this space from 1900, right? So basically this is the first revolution, and then there's this kind of lurching of flirting with more or less democratic rule, and you'll see that's one trajectory you can see other countries taking through this space, becoming more or less democratic, and what you would then see as comparable plots like I showed you for the UK, for England, which was the first one, right? Because the Enlightenment came out of Scotland. There's Hume and Adam Smith and Burke, and so you'll see a similar plot for other countries and developing economies in the last say 50 years. So okay, so that's the potted history. That's the argument that you get from an economic point of view, and then there's corollaries to this: increased living, longevity of life expectancy, health also correlates with these things. So it's not just GDP; these are stand-ins for basic measures of human welfare. And the argument that I just gave you in very brief form is one that you would get from a standard economist and policymaker. And I think it's one we probably know, but maybe have forgotten about. But there are exceptions to this. That's a first point to note, in that there are some countries that have gone from very poor in this left quadrant to very rich, and one of them happens to be China. And so it's one thing to take, let's say, this is not an economy that's extracting oil wealth or mining interest or gas out of its economy. It imports these things. So it doesn't fit this model. It's not tiny little Singapore. This was sort of the prototype for this model, the tiny little protectorate, and small by very rich, but also a very small footprint. But you could think of China as scaling Singapore's economy. So one question, one of these forces that has occurred recently is there an alternative model to bringing prosperity where, yes, in history, it seems to be that liberal democracies were a sufficient reason to explain how we became more wealthy and more healthy, but is it the only one, right? And so if you were to ask an economist, why is it the case that liberal democracies contribute to shared prosperity, you'll get three kinds of answers. Accumulation of capital is one, and improved methods for how to distribute these things. But also a third, and most of economic research tends to turn on these first two, but also learning. We get better at making stuff and telling one another how we do it, cultural transmission of knowledge. And it turns out, this is work by the Nobel laureate Stiglitz, that trying to quantify what the main drivers are, Stiglitz's work and his colleagues have said the lion's share is about learning. So you start to get an explanation of why liberal democracy, of all things, is conducive to prosperity and growth, insofar as, well, you need to be able to speak truth to power, and science kind of has these characteristics that mimic liberal democracy, where you pay attention to the facts, you go where the evidence takes you, and so the argument goes, having a political economy that enshrines these values is one explanation for our shared prosperity. So that's, again, the thing that's interesting about this in Stiglitz's argument. He'll shift from using this as an explanation for why we became wealthy to necessary conditions, right? He wants to make a stronger argument, and in fact that was the assumption for letting China in the WTO in 2001, that, well, eventually the economy will open up, and it won't be a straight line. It'll eventually start moving across to a more democratic society, start basically converging to the Western world and the Western norms. And that hasn't happened so far. So all this is to say, just reviewing the argument, and that one of the strains, pressures, is that there looks to be an alternative model, economic model on the market that is giving a real challenge to Western liberal democracies. So that's the first thing, and I'll try to tie together why I added AI to the title a little bit later, if you'll just have a little bit of patience with that. So the question where China raises is this a case of autocratic catch-up, which is, if you're Stiglitz, or sticking to this claim that yes, eventually they'll have to reform and become a liberal democracy, or is it really an alternative model that is, let's say, Singapore incorporated, scaled? Okay. So the second piece of this that I think is worth worth emphasizing are these values that I just mentioned, that liberal democracy basically it rests on two things, well, liberty and actually truth as well. So truth being fact-based, and it's a form of governance, so that you have citizenry that are paying attention and they're going to speak up and try to guide the discussion and the decision-making of how they're going to be governed. And for that to happen, the citizens, the subjects need to have liberty, right? They need to be free to gain the information, to get at the truth, and also to communicate. And here again, you can see that this is thought, at least, to be conducive to developing advanced economies and innovating, right? So this is something else that I think arguably is coming under attack, and that may be a little bit more straightforward. And that you're seeing that in Europe anyway, with this rise of a particular kind of political extremism, but it's authoritarian populism. So it's not just populist governments, but it's a particular strand that's authoritarian. Authoritarian in the sense that these are parties that are not committed to the underlying governmental structure of liberal democracy. They're anti-democratic or authoritarian. And as you can see, this has risen. This is a plot of, let's see, 33 European countries, and these are parliamentary seats. So 1 to maybe 1% or less than that to about 19% in 2017 data. So roughly 1 in 5 seats are in parliamentary houses in 33 European countries are controlled by members who don't believe in liberal democracy, don't believe in the institution, and are publicly committed to parties that are not committed to these institutions. So this is one thing that I thought was handy, which is, so these are words that are charged. I'm not claiming that particular parties are fascist or anti-fascist, but there are particular techniques that one will see in history that are used in fascist politics. This is Jason Stanley, a colleague of mine who's at Yale, and he's written a recent book, How Fascism Works. It's just like the mechanics of how is it that how this kind of political movements work. And I'll just run through, he gives 10 pillars. I'll just talk about these 9. So one is to appeal to a mythic past. Propaganda is also very a feature where you have inversions, right? So anti-corruption is about corruption. News, fake news. You're seeing instances of this all over the place, sadly, where, again, here truth is debased, right? So there's also a commitment to anti-intellectualism. So as Steve Bannon has said, we want to get people fired up. It's emotions that get people to the polls, not reason. Appeal to hierarchy, undermine truth, as we said before, and you replace this with loyalty. Victimhood, oddly enough, of the dominant group. So, and appeals to law and order. There's also a common theme of sexual anxiety. So, maybe going after people for their sexual orientation, cracking down. And of course, there's the town and country. It's the decadent people in the cities that we have to be protected from and go back to the core values of the countryside, and this feeds into this mythic past. Stanley's point is I think it's helpful insofar as, again, it's not categorizing a particular movement as fascist or not, but it's just recognizing the methods, the tools, and just sort of being aware of common and old techniques that are reused occasionally, and you may see being used in Western countries more recently. So the tech part is what I was just thinking a little bit about, trying to remove, or at least to my mind anyway, to think about why some of these forces are obscured to the public. And I want to just offer a couple of ideas that, and again, I think it's just it's a confluence of factors. It's not really a conspiracy of any kind. It's just this weird effect from many things coming together. I mean, I mentioned the economic crisis before. That's an obvious one as well. And certainly the shortcomings and failures of Western governments to deal with the aftermath of those things. These are all factors too. But one thing that I think that our broad industry has contributed to this, I think unwittingly, is that the success of tech platforms that are essentially the business model is monetizing your attention, right? So, that's the main model for our tech companies and for app developers that want to sell. If it's advertising based anyway, it's basically going to mimic this emotion over reason pillar that I mentioned before, where emotion gets people to stick onto your platform, eyeballs glued or clicks onto your website. And then we also know enough from these social networks that it's very difficult, it almost comes automatically, that you have polarization that can occur in these communities. So some of this is deliberate by design, but people were thinking about selling bottles of shampoo and vacations and other benign things. Of course, this all can be reused for more pernicious things, as we're more well aware. Cambridge Analytica was mentioned in the last talk. So this monetizing engagement, I think, is one thing, one part of this, and another is, I think, it's a cultural feature that certainly is true in the Valley, and I think probably is common amongst engineers in general, and software engineers in particular, which I would call latent libertarianism. And so here the idea is liberty, autonomy, not having people telling you what to do, including governments. This is held as a sacred principle, or a very important principle at least. And so what comes with that, I think, is a wariness of defending institutions, right? And so if everything's working fine, the background is, the governance is your liberty is protected by being in a liberal democracy, whether it's right or left libertarianism, it's fine. It's just one of many political dispositions one can have. But if you're in a situation where the underlying system of governments that protects one of these two things, liberty, is under attack, this kind of, I think, approach, which is, these values, I think, are conveyed in how we build many software projects as well, is something else that's contributing, I think, to at least us not seeing some of the forces that are straining liberal democracy clearly. So, and one thing I would just point out, that even if you're a committed libertarian, I think we would all agree that if you lived in a country where you were just lied to completely, you wouldn't have agency, you wouldn't have liberty. Look at the people of North Korea, right? They are lied to all the time. We wouldn't say that they are in a position in which they can be and act and have liberty, right? So agency requires at least some truth. That's why these two things are important, and you need to have institutions to protect these things. So, this is a short talk, and I thought I would close and open up to questions. That might be better to go, is with this quote that you can tell by the language is a little bit old, but I'll just read it out loud. And it says, how selfish soever people may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him. And I should say the quote goes on to say it's not just, it's genuine altruism. And this is the opening sentence to a book on moral sentiments by Adam Smith. So this is not some, this is a principal core person that is would be identified as a conservative thinker and founder of the Enlightenment. So with that, thank you very much.